The Model View Controller, MVC for short, is an architectural pattern that separates an app into three main components. And as you can see on this slide, the three components are model, views, and controllers. The MVC pattern helps you create apps that are testable and easier to maintain and update the traditional monolithic apps. MVC is based on these three components. Models are classes that represent the data of your app, and they use validation logic to enforce the business rules for that data. Typically, model objects retrieve and store model state in a database. In this lecture series, we're going to use Model First in Entity Framework Core, and we're going to institute those different objects associated with our classes to represent data in a SQL Server database. And on for Mac OS X, it's going to represent a SQLite database. So it's easy to think of models as representation of data that you're going to use to implement your CRUD operations. The second component of the MVC framework are views. Views are the components that display the app's user interface. Generally, the UI displays the model data. It is not used to deal with any type of business logic. It is just the user interface, and it just displays what is implemented from your model data. So typically you'll have strongly typed model classes. You'll import that into your view, and your view is just to display the data associated with your model classes. Controllers are classes that handle browser requests, retrieve model data, and specify what view templates that are returned from response to the browser. In an MVC app, the view only displays information. The controller handles and responds to the user input and interaction. For example, the controller handles route data, query string values, and passes these views to the model. It's the in-between for your HTTP request and response associated with your application. So let's look at this diagram to associate how MVC works. A user at the top right here makes a HTTP request to your application to look at a page or to look at some resource in your app. That request is routed directly to your controller. The controller handles all of the HTTP requests associated in your application. Once the request is emitted, it acts as an in-between between your model and view. So the controller is requested. It looks for the action on that controller, looks at any business logic implemented inside of that controller, whether you're pulling data from classes or implementing an entity framework repository, takes that model. Inside of that, the controller handles the model data. The controller then specifies what view templates that's returned a response to the browser. So in this case, once the request is made to the controller, it looks at what action is being requested. And then from there, it emits whatever data is implemented in your model, and then emits that back into the view as a response. And as you can see from this diagram, the response is emitted on the UI side. The controller handles and responds to the user input and interaction. So in this case, the user will make a request. It will go to the controller. The controller has logic inside of it associated with model data. That model data is then emitted into the view, and the controller handles the in-between for the model and the view. So this is essentially how MVC works. The MVC pattern helps you create apps that separate different aspects of your app while providing a loose coupling between elements. The pattern specifies what each kind of logic should be and located in the app. The UI logic belongs to the view. The input logic belongs to the controller. So you're separating your business logic, your UI logic, and input logic. So anytime you have to troubleshoot any issues with your app, it's separated and loosely coupled between the three different components. In ASP.NET Web Forms, the UI is tied to the business logic layer, so there's no loose coupling between your UI and your business logic. In MVC, it's separated into three different components. This is how we configure MVC in a .NET Core project.json file. As you can see, we added the dependency of Microsoft.asp.NET Core.mvc. In this case, RC2 is the final version. As newer versions come out, these have to be updated. And then as you can see, the Razor tools associated inside of our project so we can implement CS/HTML pages. So this must be added to as well to implement MVC inside of your project. The Razor tooling to implement your views to associate with your CS/HTML pages. As you can see here, this is how you configure MVC in your .NET Core startup.cs file. Right here in the configure services method, we add to the iService collection services.addMVC. Then once we add it to our application to be able to be injected, we have to configure the HTTP pipeline to associate on the iApplication Builder class to use MVC and to associate the default route for MVC. And in this case, our default controller is home, our action is index, and the ID is not required, it's optional. But in this case, this is how we set up our routing associated with MVC, so that when we go to the next slide, you can see the file structure associated with MVC in our project. We have the home controller, and associated inside of the view is a folder named home. And inside of the home folder, you have an index.cs HTML page. And then if you go to the home controller.cs file, you will see a method on that controller associated to index. And then as we configured here, in the startup.cs file, if you look at the routes, we have the home controller and the action index. And this will be our default route in our application. So as we go through each section dealing with MVC, we will analyze and look at the different ways to implement that, whether it's routing, the different return types in MVC. As we keep going through this lecture series, we're going to configure every aspect associated with MVC, whether it's a layout page, view components. We're going to delve into everything we need to know about MVC and all the great new features of MVC 6. So let's go ahead and let's start configuring our ASP.NET Core application to utilize MVC. I want to thank you for joining me in this lecture. Have a nice day.